right-wing news. This video brought to you by Noble Gold.
Feeling concerned about your current or upcoming retirement? Have you been working hard all of your life, yet still feel stressed about your financial future? Retirement accounts, return on savings and CDs offer insufficient assurance. Noble Gold is here to ease your worries. Protect your money and savings by buying gold. Why gold? Gold is tangible, and its value can't be controlled by the government. Gold is also the ultimate hedge against bank collapses or inflation. Why should you invest now? Central banks are already buying gold to protect their assets. And based on the history of stock market cycles, hyperinflation is just around the corner. What are your options? Sign up for a gold retirement account or make private purchases. It's a great step towards a financially secure future with our 20 years of combined experience and investments of $200 million in precious metals for our clients. Take control of your investments and ensure your future by contacting Noble Gold today.
I'm your host, the voice of reason, and as promised, I've got a very special guest with us today, Dr. Jim Willie, editor of the Hat Trick Letter, which can be found at goldenjackass.com. Incidentally, there will be a link to subscribe to his Hat Trick Letter in the notes section of this video, so be sure to check that out. Dr. Willie, how you doing this morning?
I'm hanging in there, and I'm beginning to believe that for the rest of the summer and going into the fall, we're going to have a string of very disruptive events. And it's been disrupted all year, but I think it's going to be more disruptive and accelerate. Like in the recent few days, it's quite clear that Germany is going to be ignoring the Russian sanctions. So these are very important events.
Now, it's interesting that you say that we've got some very important and very interesting events coming up. And I don't want to detract from talking about those a whole lot. I just wanted to see if you had any particular opinion, because they are so important, as is so much of the information that I pride myself on getting to the American people, because God knows our mainstream media won't do it if it's of any importance. It's got to be fictional or completely absurd for them to report on. I'm curious if you have any opinions or any thoughts as to, basically the world's largest corporations, these multinational globalist corporations in their boardrooms, taking it upon themselves to decide what is okay to think and what is okay to say on the internet, and they're doing so with their deep pockets by literally trying to starve out anyone who's voicing truth. I'm just curious if you had any thoughts on that, because you are a man that I look to for a lot of truth, and I certainly wouldn't want your voice or any of the other few that I go to be silenced, but God knows they're trying.
Well, this is a censorship effort. It's becoming more of a widespread national initiative, but it started really with the fake news law, which is essentially a fascist government system declaration that they manage truth. And I laughed when the law was passed in Congress, and shortly afterwards it seemed like YouTube and Google followed up rather well with the censorship. And I've heard some complaints, rather strident complaints from some people, that their income stream was down something like 60%. Whenever I hear about income stream down as a result of YouTube or some alternative news sourcing of income, I don't hear of anything under one half. It seems always over 50%. I frequently do a little test with Google searches. And today I did Michael Pinto Yellow Snow, and it came up, one of the entries among many was the Golden Jackass website, because I have you and your site as an upcoming interview, future attractions in the next couple of weeks. So the search mechanisms are not brutal in their censorship, but I talk with I shouldn't mention it, a certain host who sells coins, and he said that sales were down 60 to 70% versus last year. And he said it's not just the economy, it's the censorship. So the searches are not quite as effective. Yeah, there are boardroom efforts to continue in the fascist censorship that are very real. And I don't know that it's going to serve them very well, because they're getting really bashed lately for their nonsensical anti-Trump, gosh, the Russians really affected the U.S. elections? Well, gosh, what about the Hillary vote fraud of perhaps 6 to 8 million votes? What about the Clinton Foundation sale of uranium to Russia with a kickback of $20 million? So, the censorship is getting exposed as nonsensical and very twisted. I just had an email with a graphic sent to me of the executives of CNN. And it had a theme on it. I got to be careful with my wording here. It had a theme on it. And 3 levels of executive management had something like 95, 98% from one particular ethnic group. And they don't eat pork. I'm not talking about Arabs. I don't give a rat's ass about Arabs in corporate management. They're too busy burning down their libraries to be leading corporations. But there is a very real censorship going on. It's not going to serve the fascist corporations well. I think it's going to drive more people to the alternative news, and it's going to result in a lot more of the population distrusting the mainstream news, and that's a phenomenon very well along.
Well, I certainly hope you're right. I hope more people continue to keep an open ear to the alternative news, because I know you've got a lot to say, and it's a lot of information that I know they're not going to hear anywhere else. So, I won't bog you down in the issues of those of us, on social media. I was just curious to hear what your take was on that. But there's an awful lot going on. I've heard you talk in recent weeks a lot about the potential for trade wars. What I think is somewhat ironic about that is when that happens, Trump will get the blame for it, even though much of the literal physical infrastructure that's going to be the cause or part of the cause of these trade wars has been in place long before he ever took office. But I'm curious to get your take on where these trade wars and some of our coming economic woes are going to be coming from, because I believe they're going to be aplenty.
The big brewing trade war is with Germany. Back in 2014, following the Ukraine invasion by the United States, which was then translated into a Russian annexation, illegal, of Crimea, the U.S. and the Victoria Nuland State Department spent $5 billion to force the Ukraine coup d'etat, the Maidan Square uprising. And, one of the very strange elements of this cost was hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of amphetamines that were passed out in order to increase the crazy level in Kiev, capital of Ukraine. So the U.S. had a mission to execute a color revolution in Ukraine, blame it on Russia, and one of the strains that came from that was the Germans becoming very worried about Washington-based attacks on their energy supply. And I interpreted, translated, put it in my own words, that the Russian sanctions simply did not apply to the Russian gas pipelines going to Germany. And that is still the case, except for the marginal example, the marginal project, which is Nord Stream 2. Pardon me. I have trouble clearing my throat based on the after effects of this illness. All right, so 2 weeks ago, in their incredibly poor judgment, the U.S. Congress decided to have put in place potential sanctions against German companies involved in the construction of Nord Stream 2, which is an underwater pipe system under the Baltic Sea, the northern route, thus Nord is German for north, to Russia. Not just the construction companies in Germany, but the finance companies working toward the construction in Germany.
Now, you see it was a poor decision on their part. I'm hoping you'll probably get to that. But being a NATO ally and the sanctions being again, why? I'm not saying that it does make sense, but from their perspective, they being Congress, why would that have been a bad decision? In other words, not in keeping with NATO and our alliance with them.
Because Russia is the biggest source of energy for Germany and their industry, and Germany owns the biggest industrial base in all of Europe. Would you consider it wise if I told you that I was going to put sanctions on all your sources of blood supply?
No.
If I were to put a sanction on all your sources of oxygen supply?
No, absolutely not.
And food supply? Imagine the Germans telling the United States, we no longer are comfortable, we're going to sanction all your companies that are accepting Latin American food supply to the United States. Can you think of something more absurd?
No, the only pushback I would give is I would think that would be somewhat par for the course for being part of NATO, not to be, overstepping the sanctions put in place against Russia. Not that I'm saying I disagree with what they're doing from their perspective. From their perspective, I agree with it 100%, they being Germany. I just see where it's a rather sticky situation that I suspect is only going to get worse.
Yeah, well, to be clear, the United States doesn't want a NATO nation like Germany to be dependent commercially on Russia.
Exactly.
But we're not talking about, tanks and airplanes and ship construction. We're talking about German industry. German industry is all over the map. We're talking about dozens of sectors. We're not talking about military contractors. We're talking about their general industry. Okay, so the German reaction, Mike, was to say, stay out of our business, Washington. Don't try to manage our economy. Don't tell us where we're going to source our energy supply. And if you try to slap sanctions on our German companies for construction and finance of Nord Stream 2, we're going to start slapping sanctions on American companies operating in Germany. Mike, this is unprecedented.
And that's more the point that I was making, that we are way overstepping our bounds, and there is going to be some pushback from it, without a doubt.
Overstepping our bounds is a very nice way of putting it. We're trying to act like fascist global dictators to a vassal state. And what's coming up is Germany is going to say, we don't pay any attention to the Russian sanctions. We'll do exactly as we see fit for the good of Germany. And you can, in Washington, you can make all the pronouncements you want, but they will fall on deaf ears. It has spread because the new French president, Emmanuel Macron, he also had a meeting with Putin, and he announced that they were going to revive a lot of Russian trade that had fallen by the wayside in the last couple of years. So this is getting to a flashpoint on ignoring the Russian sanctions, which is a jackass forecast I made 2 years ago. I said eventually the Washington-based stated sanctions against Russia will be ignored by the European Union member states.
I believe you also made a prediction that they would move their financing further east, if you catch my drift.
Yeah, and I also made a general jackass forecast that Germany would flip east.
Yeah.
They would see their economic future with the Eurasian trade zone and not with any U.S.-led fascist trade union like the Transatlantic Trade Partnership. It's going nowhere. And not a single European nation now is promoting its advancement, that U.S. Obama-led trade union. Look at the details of the U.S.-led trade union, and you see fascist characteristics all over the place. I have an interesting little theme that I have been bandying about with clients and friends. I say, isn't it interesting that the United States is marching just so aggressively toward a fascist state? They have a fascist state. They're ingraining more fascist state laws and regulations, yet the public doesn't recognize it. And one of the main reasons they don't recognize it is that they don't even know what fascism is.
If they knew what fascism was, the media still wouldn't report it to them anyway. And therein lies kind of this whole circular problem, but I agree 100%.
Well, the media doesn't report what it is because they're central to the fascist movement.
Yep.
Fascism is the merging of the state with major corporations, and its consequence is the consolidation of power within the corporate sector and the advancement of corruption of all sorts of things. I love the Italian maxim, the fish rots from the head down.
Indeed.
So you're seeing corruption in every conceivable U.S. financial, I don't want to call it sector because that's too big, every conceivable segment within the financial structure, including like pension management, including like charities. Did you know United Way has 95% overhead costs?
No.
Anyone donating to United Way is a moron. The Heart Fund various very popular charitable organizations like, the Heart Fund, Cancer, American Cancer Society, they all have costs, overhead costs of over 90%. Take a look at their executives, and you see they've got a corporate Mercedes. They've got, $1 million salaries. And then you look, what is it? What did they actually have for the charitable output? And it's under 5% of their budget. Okay, this is normal. Pardon me. The Dallas, Texas police and fire pension was stricken by gigantic fraud. We're not talking about things like Chicago and Illinois, just basic bankruptcy. We're talking about fraud that undermines an already weak pension system in Dallas. So now they're considering a 20% property tax increase in Dallas. So the result of that is a lot of people are leaving Dallas. Okay, the fascist business model covers major corporations like energy to make sure that we don't get off the diesel and gasoline business model. It involves big pharma, where they put the actual virus in the vaccines, where they put other dangerous agents in the vaccines, like to make sure that your resistance to cancer and illness is not eliminated, but reduced severely. So you get sick more and become a good big pharma customer. The fascist business model is evident in the news networks. I mean, I once in a while turn on CNN, turn on one of the other news.
You're the one. I knew there was somebody who did.
Just to see how stupid it is. A debate over the Russians' influence of the U.S. elections 8 months or 7 months after the election. Move on, people. Okay, I like to say that the U.S. political framework in Washington has two political parties. They're not Democrat and Republican, because the fascist neocons cut across both parties. A lot of very dim-witted political followers believe that the neocons are just Republicans because that's what Baby Bush advanced and promoted. Well, does anybody realize the Obama State Department was the identical people as Bush II administration State Department? My brother didn't realize that. He calls himself a student of politics. I say, John, you're an idiot. You don't follow anything. You don't know what fascism is. You don't know what money is. You got Phi Beta Kappa for political science and economics. You don't know what gold and money are. And you don't know what fascism is. You're an idiot. And he said, well, maybe we just shouldn't talk about this. And he said, Jim, I'm a big fan of Obama's. And I said, John, therefore, you're something of an idiot. Okay, the fascist business model cuts across many different corporate sectors. Another very big one is military-industrial complex, the weapons contractors. The big banks are another. I mean, if you had done, I hate to say this, Mike, but 6, 7, 8 years ago, if you had said, I'm not going to invest anything in gold, I'm just going to invest in the military contractors and the big banks that had a brush with death, well, you'd be up 20-fold on your investments. That's how pervasive the corruption is. But it's going to come to an end. And I think it's going to come to an end with respect to trade payments. But just to close on the German situation, I have never seen the level of defiance that I heard from the economics minister, I think that's his title, Gabriel, and a couple of other leaders, not Merkel, a defiant attitude toward the United States to get out of their business, and it's very clear the writing on the walls in Germany. They're going to be brushing aside the Russian sanctions. As for Merkel, who is being more and more widely exposed as Hitler's daughter, I know it sounds crazy. Do some research. Her most recent statements have been Germany can no longer count on the United States. Pardon me. Pardon me. Germany can no longer count on the United States for leadership, protection, and, just shining the light on the future paths. What I'm, pardon me, I'm having a lot of trouble clearing my throat these days, but I'm okay. The brain works great. The way to interpret that for Merkel is that they're not going to follow the U.S. regarding the trade union, regarding management of the European Union, nor following the Russian sanctions, which have done very serious harm to the German economy. Let me give you an example of how the Germans responded in the last 2 or 3 years. They might have a big conglomerate that used to export a lot to Russia. There's one company, I don't remember its full name, but Metallschaft is part of their name. It just means a metals company, general corporation, but a lot more than just metals. They founded a string of Russian-based German subsidiaries. So instead of making it in Germany and shipping it to Russia in violation of the sanctions, they're making it in Russia and shipping it domestically within Russia. That's all very legal. And the United States could have said, wait a minute, you can't go setting up subsidiaries in Russia. But the United States left it alone. The United States has not been enforcing strictly its own sanctions. I mean, come on, let's think about this more rationally. Since when does the United States dictate rules to European sovereign states on their trade patterns with Russia? Since when does the United States have the authority to come down on UBS and Credit Suisse, the two major banks in Switzerland? I thought that's a sovereign nation. So you're seeing the effect of globalism in Washington-based edicts.
Since when
if
does
you're wondering
Washington...
what was that all about in Switzerland, it was for the United States to gain control of those two big banks so they could steal all the Arab gold in the bullion banks in Switzerland on the Arab accounts. And what they did was they forced the Saudis to take a whole big batch of their gold and move it to France and hide it in Deutsche Bank. So the Arabs are very busy protecting the gold from the ravenous hands of the Americans. Okay, so the Russians are going to enjoy more trade with the European Union member states. That's coming. They're going to reverse. The Europeans are going to reverse some of their sanctions and just say, we don't give a crap about your Washington sanctions. We're going to do it because it's good for our economy.
Question. Aside from the obvious potential problems that raises with NATO, what about the Shanghai Corporation? Wasn't that founded predominantly as an economic group, but now includes, I believe they've brought on this year probationary members, so to speak, Iran, India, Pakistan, Russia, and then it's Russia, China. It's roughly 6 nuclear powers that are not aligned with us, that are all aligned economically, but it seems to be more and more militarily as well. Any thoughts on, as Germany continues to distance itself from us, how that may impact things?
Yeah, let me set the table here. It's called the Shanghai Cooperative Organization. It was set up about 12 or 13, 14 years ago. It was primarily Russia, originally. Russia, China, and the former Soviet republics. They wanted to have a combination of security and cultural exchange. And it's been quite successful for them. The most recent additions have been, just in the last month, India and Pakistan, with actual induction, not just consideration. They're now in SCO, Shanghai Co-op Organization, SCO. Russia and China have ambitions to make it more of a security organization than anything else. Okay, if you want to have student exchanges and, tours of a couple hundred people to visit the various hot spots of a country and, meet with other students and gather in universities and have these wonderful forums. Okay, that's all great. But when you start making it more security-based, like shared missile systems, like agreements that if Pakistan is overrun by the U.S. military, that the Chinese and Russia military would respond. That's a bit bigger. Okay, now, the most recent inductions of Pakistan and India are all well and good, very important. The big entry that I'm looking toward is the actual induction of Iran.
Indeed.
Look at it this way. Americans don't think in terms of former ancient empires, but the Eurasian Trade Zone, with their SCO security blanket, now covers the Chinese Empire, the Russian Empire, the Indian, I don't know whether you call it empire, but subcontinent, and the Persian Empire coming up. The United States cannot go up against 3 or 4 ancient empires. The United States is finding itself blocked just by the Russian-Chinese union joining of forces.
Well, I know our military members don't like to hear this, and I certainly don't mean to demean them in any way, but we've been bogged down in a 16-year war against an enemy that still fights in sandals. There is no way we could go up against the likes of, a combined Russia and China. We would be absolutely annihilated, and I know that that's blasphemy to a lot of Americans, but it's the simple fact of the matter. They're way more technologically advanced than, obviously, our foes in Afghanistan and Iraq have been. Okay, so it is indeed Iraq and Afghanistan that you're referring to. Mm-hmm. Yeah, enemies in sandals. Rather than, my way of thinking is not so much enemies in sandals as it is enemies engaged in asymmetric warfare. Just imagine, say, a U.S.-built tank might cost, I don't really know what a U.S. tank costs. Is it $5 million, $18 million? I don't know. We'll agree it's a lot.
It's a lot. It's multi-million. But the weapon used to destroy a tank might cost about $86 by these guys who wear sandals. The interactive explosive device, mm-hmm. IED. IED is now an acronym in common military nomenclature, whereas 20 years ago it was not. So it's like putting a tiny cell phone on some CMEX explosives and detonating it from 700 yards away inside a shack. We're seeing a lot of asymmetric warfare being waged against the United States. And, we you have to think in different terms from what we're taught. What is the objective of the Afghan war? Is it really to halt the Taliban so they don't do another 9/11 attack? These cave dwellers who could not erect cell towers in their own country, did they really enter the United States and bring down the towers? I don't think so. That was a very sophisticated, elaborate event that required the collusion of Langley, Mossad, the Bush crime family, and a number of other groups having nothing to do with the Arabs or the Muslims. So what is the motive of the Afghan war? It is to secure the prize where 80% of the world's heroin is produced. That's the prize. So if we're losing the war in Afghanistan to the cave dwellers wearing sandals, using IEDs to bring down our expensive weapons, do we really give a shit? Because we still have the heroin business. So the big question regarding Afghanistan should be, how's the heroin business doing? How's the heroin production doing? How's the vertically integrated chemical processing factory system working in Afghanistan? The answer? It's great.
It must be, because our monetary system's certainly not going to be able to support our way of life. We're going to need something to do it.
No, that's I think a very faulty perspective, Mike. We're not going to be relying on heroin production to finance the U.S. deficit or to finance the credit supply within the U.S. economy. The Afghan heroin is going to supply the terrorist groups and guerrilla mercenaries like ISIS. It's to produce the second source of war funding. You have the Pentagon and you have Langley. The Pentagon is financed by the taxpayers, U.S. government, deficit, bondholders, etc. In other words, the QE bond monetization, Zimbabwe and South American style. But the second war effort is from Langley, from the Bush crowd, from the narcotics.
Right.
So,
there was a bit of a facetious statement, and the reason I say that isn't that the sale ultimately intended to do exactly as you just said, continue to amp up the war machine, keep beating the drums of war until eventually there is war, because essentially the U.S. dollar is not really backed by a whole lot of anything more than the might of the American military. Forget gold, forget the petrodollar. And the way I see it, the only thing that the U.S. dollar is really backed by today is the full faith and might of the U.S. military, and we need a war in which that can help us facilitate, whether it be beginning by proxy until we can get it into a full-blown war. That's kind of my interpretation. I was being a little bit sarcastic with that.
I know you were, but it's important for the listeners to understand, where does the narcotics money go? It goes into the war machine with the mercenaries, namely ISIS, but it also goes into Big Pharma. Big Pharma is an enormous beneficiary of the heroin going into their opioid business. I mean, like Percocet and a few of the other narcotics-based painkillers. Just in 2016, And just in the state of Ohio, there were 880 million prescriptions of opioids. That's shocking. The price of heroin now has gotten to be cheaper than marijuana in U.S. streets. This is the effect of the Afghan war. The opioid painkiller addiction is a very big highway leading directly to heroin addiction in the U.S. streets. I agree that the dollar is backed by the war machine. I had a forecast way back when this newsletter was started in 2004. But the following year in 2005, I started making a lot of statements that eventually the U.S. dollar is going to be defended by war. And naturally, I got a lot of people saying, gosh, Jim, you say a lot of stupid things. And I said, just give it time, you idiot. I don't expect to hear from you after it becomes rather obvious. There are two factors now supporting the dollar. It's the military, but it's also QE. The hypermonetary inflation, the bond purchase program for the Federal Reserve. If you stop QE, I guarantee you in 6 months, the U.S. Treasury bonds will have a bond yield of over 6% and then move toward where Italy and Greece were when their crises hit hard. QE is a death blow to foreign currencies because it supports the U.S. currency in ways that foreign sovereign nations cannot protect their own currency. So you see things like a 5-fold drop in the Brazilian real in the last several years. So you see, closer to home, and I monitor things like this because I know some Dominicanos, their currency is down 40%. And they asked me, why is Costa Rica seeing a rather stable currency, but the Dominican peso is not? And I say to them, because the Dominican government is not doing narcotics money laundering as a favor to support the currency. What I just said there is a rather powerful statement, and I'd like to leave that topic alone. Okay, so the dollar is being supported by war and hypermonetary inflation. We're monetizing almost our entire U.S. government federal debt. Now, you're going to find some Chinese purchases of U.S. Treasury bonds. You're going to find some Japanese purchases. What I found remarkable was that there was almost a complete correlation between the Japanese currency and the gold price. We're using the Japanese currency as a method to suppress the gold price. That's why it's not a trade war, unlike U.S. and Germany, but we're starting to see the Japanese move away from what's called the dollar sphere, the dollar universe, USD universe. We're starting to see the Japanese sign on to say usage of the SWIFT bank transaction alternative.
Sure.
The Japanese are now using the CIPS. Now, CIPS stands for Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, but it's also known as the Chinese Interbank Payment System. It's the alternative to SWIFT. SWIFT is what the United States has been using against Iran to prevent them from doing any dollar-based transactions. So you have the Japanese also developing some LNG projects with Russia. That's all excellent toward the Japanese marginally joining the Eurasian trade zone. These sanctions using the dollar weapons are not working well. Iran, of course, it suffered some price inflation. Of course, it suffered from some economic recession. But it's coming back. We did not cripple Iran. We just punched them in the gut, kicked them in the groin, and took them to the ground, and they're getting up.
And with the advent of the new Chinese system, up until that point, the world was dependent more or less on SWIFT. And so we've lost a tremendous amount of our leverage against some of these quote-unquote rogue regimes, correct?
Yes. We're now being seen as a paper tiger in both military and financial perspectives. Little countries are seeing we're not going to get much economic development if we stay in this dollar universe. So they're moving into the Eurasian trade zone. They're signing up with the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. There's only one G7 nation now that's not in the AIIB bank, and that's the United States. So do you think there are going to be any American corporations that are going to benefit from the multi-billion, perhaps trillion-dollar infrastructure set of projects on the table for the Eurasian trade zone, the One Belt, One Road? Absolutely not. Your American companies are going to be locked out. It's going to be part of the isolation that I've been talking about for the last few years.
So as the demise of these smaller nations using anything denominated in U.S. dollars and therefore no longer having any need to hold on to their treasuries, we're more than likely, I would imagine, at some point, I would have expected sooner before later, I still think it'll be sooner before way later, we'll start to see some of those dumping, but and because of what we're seeing going on in the COMEX markets where, there's some ungodly number of, paper contracts sold per the actual amount of gold and silver, could that have something to do with, you think, why so many people, I shouldn't say so many, but why a large number of people are beginning to flock to, rather than just physical gold and silver, but also the cryptocurrencies at this point, because there's got to be somewhere people are going, knowing that all the rest of this is just one giant game by the elites.
Yeah, I think that there's a multiple response to the corrupt dollar universe. You obviously have the gold and silver purchases in bars and coins. You have, say, investments in Asian companies that are going to be involved in the massive construction. But in the electronic side, there's no doubt that the anti-dollar sentiment is not just anti-dollar, it's anti-forex. I mean, if you're opposed to the dollar for its weak construction and foundation, you should also be opposed to the euro and the Japanese yen. It has the same construction, same foundation. So we're seeing a rise of the cryptocurrencies. Think of it as 1,000 points of light in the electronic world that are opposed to the dollar, that are opposed to the entire fiat currency forex system. So yeah, there's a big rebellion going on, and it's going to get exciting very soon because we're already starting to hear about formal plans of having gold-backed cryptocurrencies. Now, one of the big beauties of the cryptocurrency is its portability. If you've got internet usage at point A and point B, then you can have the transfer done through their encryption and through their technology safely, securely, without having to deal with SWIFT, without having to deal with the bank rules, without having to deal with the U.S. government regulatory bodies. It's like an electronic rebellion going on. It's powerful. It's not going to stop. It has to sort things out, though, regarding the players, regarding their characteristics, regarding their efficiencies, their securities, their encryption. I think most of them have the encryption down. That's not a dividing factor anymore. The dividing factors are efficiency and security. So it's an exciting time. I'd like to take this quick opportunity to explain a forecast of mine. And that is that we're heading toward a dual universe. The dollar sphere is going to continue. That won't stop until it's dead. Its main blockade is going to come with trade payments. Like, for instance, the exciting development that's coming up very soon with respect to the Chinese paying for Saudi oil in RMB and not dollars. When that happens, you're going to see the RMB universe flourish. You're going to see other Pacific Rim countries say to the Arabs, and maybe to all of OPEC, which is dominated by Gulf Arabs, but you still have, Venezuela and Nigeria and a few others, Mexico. They're exporters. Mexico's not a significant exporter anymore. But the RMB universe is going to see other Asian nations say, we'd rather not keep a store of, of saved, reserves in the form of treasury bonds. We'd rather, since we're Asian and we do a lot more business with China, we'd rather store in RMB bonds and other RMB instruments. And we want to pay for our Arab oil in RMB. Okay, so that'll advance the RMB universe while the dollar universe continues but gets whittled away on its margin. You're even going to see some European countries make distance, not completely, but make some distance away from the dollar, because they're going to start getting involved with the Chinese panda bonds, which are foreign issuers of RMB-based bonds. Now imagine Italy wants to finance some of their giant deficit, wants to finance some of their bank bailouts, and they don't want to use the euro. They want to use the RMB. Well, they'd finance their deficit using RMB bonds, the panda bonds. Panda bonds are going to become kind of a household term, much like the Brady bonds were in the 90s to finance Latin American debt. So the dual universe is going to come about in a much more recognized way. An emerging market nation is going to say, we're signing up with the RMB universe. We're already in the AIIB Infrastructure Investment Bank. We're working towards SCO membership for security. We have lots of different one belt, one road construction contracts with Chinese and other backers. And we're going to be much more devoted to the RMB universe than we are the dollar universe, because we're going to be busy defaulting on our dollar loans that were fraudulently sold to us without proper risk explanations. Think of a country like Bangladesh. They've got a rather significant dollar-based debt that they were sold because it was such a low interest rate. They were not told that your big risk is for currency. As their currency fell, it came as a result of QE, where the dollar was defended by the paper machinery, derivatives, and just direct printing of money to cover debt. It's called monetization of debt. it's a characteristic of a third world country. It usually results in a currency collapse. I don't think the dollar is going to collapse. I think it's going to vanish. But after we see the dual universe of the dollar opposed by the RMB. And when the RMB and the Eastern nations come up with their gold vehicles, like the gold trade note, like the gold-based cryptos, and those are going to be merged in with currency and the gold trade note. When the Eastern nations introduce gold into their RMB universe, start the countdown for the introduction of the new Scheich dollar, because that will essentially undermine in a powerful way the legitimacy of the dollar as a global currency reserve.
So, Jim, one of the things I try to do for my listeners is, explain what the problems are and then propose potential solutions. And I'm often talking about, now it sounds an awful lot like we're talking about the discontinuance of the dollar as the world reserve, whether it's the discontinuance or just the dilution of, more countries gradually shifting away. The bottom line is that's going to be very, very painful for most Americans, and anybody under the age of 70 that hasn't lived in a world where the dollar was not the world reserve currency has no idea what that means to lose that status or to have it severely diluted. And that's certainly by design. You can be sure that the public schools aren't teaching that for a reason. Neither are universities. If you're not specifically into economics or reading up on your own on that, people just have no idea. So when you talk about the Scheich dollar and its purchasing power, can you tell, just because I get tired of saying it, maybe it'll be better coming from you, people are going to feel real. It's not like when our federal budget deficit went from 15 trillion to 20 trillion and nobody really saw that much of a change in their individual lives. If you see a decrease in the purchasing power of the dollar by 50%, you are going to feel agonizing pain from that as an everyday American. Am I right?
Yes. And one must focus on how it's going to come about. As the RMB universe grows, the dollar as an instrument in trade payment is going to be lessened. It's going to be reduced in its usage and popularity. As that happens, the dollar will not be used for the trade payment, and therefore we'll see a tremendous amount of treasury bond dumping from foreign banking systems. Now, those are the two pieces that comprise the global currency function. Trade payment, bank reserves, both. They're tied. If you start using the RMB more for oil payments, those countries making the Arab purchases of oil are not going to hold treasury bonds in their banking systems as much. When that happens, the dollar is going to undergo a crisis like we've never seen before. I call it the dollar global rejection. When this happens, there's going to be a focal point of import shipments to the United States. This is where rubber hits the road. This is where you're going to see the U.S. nation and its corporate captains come to the government and say, we can no longer guarantee import supply. We can no longer guarantee the supply chain. We can no longer assure that the entire supply chain will continue uninterrupted This is the issue. The United States is an import nation. I don't have the exact figures, but I would think that of all the supplies used within the U.S. economy, probably between 60 and 65% are imported.
Bill Holman did a piece some time ago stating that any civilized nation is only 72 hours away from total anarchy once those supply chains are cut. And I think that's basically what you're getting at. Once the credit is shut off, then people aren't going to keep shipping us stuff for free, which means the supply chains are cut, which means people are going to have to do some pretty unthinkable things to get the basic necessities. Pretty much.
Yes. But I like to think of it in high macro terms. The entire import supply chain is going to be at risk when the RMB universe advances, because foreign nations are going to demand that they import to the United States on condition that the dollar not be used in payments, because they don't want it anymore. This is where rubber hits the road. This is where the United States is going to be forced to come up with a different dollar that is not the global currency reserve, because that's being discharged. It's being avoided. They're going to have to come up with a U.S.-only dollar. I call it the Scheisse dollar for a simple reason, because its fundamentals resemble a third world country. We have a $550 billion trade deficit, which translates to 13,000 tons of gold. Now, that's a rather powerful statement. A $550 billion annual trade deficit. And if we back it with assets, this new currency, we're going to shed the equivalent of 13,000 tons of gold.
Puts things in a whole new perspective now, doesn't it?
Remember, Fort Knox, when it had any gold, had 8,500 or 8,700 tons. When the U.S. has to come up with a new dollar, the big issue is going to be, what's its foundation? What's its backing? The U.S. is going to say, well, we have a lot of deep storage gold. We have mineral deposits. We have a strategic petroleum reserve. Let me just put the strategic petroleum reserve into perspective. I did a calculation of its volume, multiplied by a nice standard benchmark, $50. Now, this is what we call napkin math, rough calculations. It came up to $7 billion. So our trade deficit is 70 or 80 times that. So if we just back it with our strategic oil reserve, we need 70 of them. If we back it with gold, we'll lose 13,000 tons in the first year. Here's where it gets even worse than what I'm describing. If we go on a massive reindustrialization movement so that we can start exporting more and relieving the trade deficit, we have to worry about the second year. We're not even making progress. The Trump $1 trillion infrastructure project is nowhere. We haven't even begun. So we're not going to be looking at $550 billion followed by a lesser figure. We're going to be looking at $600 billion. $600 billion this year. So next year, maybe $650. We're not going even in the right direction.
And that's why we hear the drums of war beating.
Yeah, so that countries don't join the RMB universe.
We will use the might of the American military and our big bombs to back our dollar to ensure that nobody gets the bright idea that folks like Saddam had way back in the day. I would believe that that's the plan for why we're hearing all these war drums beating as loud as we are, because there's really no other way out of it. Not that that's really a way out of it by any stretch.
Yes. We're just trying to discourage nations from exiting the dollar universe. It's like we're saying, Iran, if you want to do all this trade with China and not use the dollar, we're going to call you a terrorist nation. We've overused the word terrorist to the point where the United States is going to be uniformly regarded as a rogue state. We cannot do military exercises off the coast of every nation that's considering to dump their treasury bonds. We can't do that. It's just not going to work.
And to my listeners, this is why I paint the picture that there is such a need, is particularly if you're one of these families that's lucky enough to have somebody employed, that you're not one of the 102 million unemployed Americans right now, and you've got the means to put something away for a so-called rainy day. You know, there is a reason that the German government was warning its people to be preparing food and medical supplies for an existence-threatening event. You know, there's a reason the Czech Republic was warning its citizens of the same thing. There's a reason why Russians are training civilians for incoming nuclear attacks, and it's because there is some you-know-what coming down the pike that is going to be hitting the fan no matter what. So that is why I'm constantly beating the drum that you prepare. Dr. Willie does an unbelievable job of just really making that very palpable, how scary things truly are. But I encourage each one of you to not be fearful of it, but to embrace it and do what you can to prepare for it, to the extent that you can. Dr. Willie, I know we've kept you for a while. Is there any closing remarks or anything that you'd like to finish out with, other than, of course, giving everybody your website once again?
I don't have any great closing remarks. Well, maybe a couple comments.
Shoot.
About Qatar.
Absolutely.
I don't want to get into a full-blown discussion because I'm out of voice. Qatar is evidence. The troubles with Qatar, the focus on Qatar, the challenges made by the Saudis against Qatar, it's all evidence that the petrodollar foundation that has for 40 years been operating in the Saudi kingdom is no more. Qatar has recently changed sides. They were going with the Saudi-Iraqi pipeline to supply Europe. Now Qatar is going to go with the Iran-Qatar pipeline to Europe. We're starting to see evidence now that a core element within the Gulf Arab region is fully subscribed to the Russian-Iran gas pipeline that I think is so significant, because if the petrodollar standard, that cartel that included OPEC supported the dollar. By supporting a higher oil price, it supported a higher dollar. With the void of the absent petrodollar standard and cartel, you're seeing the void filled by the Russian, Qatar, Iran gas pipeline and its associated cartel. The new natural gas, nat gas cartel is going to be a backbone for the Eurasian trade zone and a highway a channel for the advancement of the RMB and the development of the RMB universe, which opposes the dollar. So Qatar is now a focal point for the energy system and payment routes for the Eurasian trade zone advanced by China and Russia in opposition to the dollar. It's going to get very delicate because in Qatar, the U.S. has a couple of military bases.
Mm-hmm.
They also have CENTCOM, which is a command control center, not just for all of our war activities in the Arab world and North Africa, MENA, Middle East, North Africa, MENA, but in Afghanistan. And I assure you, it's not so much a war effort management as it is a narcotics management effort. So is the United States going to say to Qatar, we're going to do a military coup and take over your emirate state just so we can keep the dollar in place? Qatar is interesting. They've got German connections and Russian connections with respect to LNG technology and pipelines and shipping. Those ships with a funny big dome or a series of 5 or 6 domes. Qatar, I think, is going to be, this is my forecast, the focal point that results in the United States surrendering to the RMB universe and its development. We're going to make a statement pretty much like we're going to work toward peaceful coexistence with the dollar universe and the rising RMB universe. And it's going to sound all very nice until the Chinese introduce gold into their currency or their trade payment system or into their cryptocurrencies. When that happens, start the countdown for the introduction of the new Scheich dollar. And just as a closing remark, this new Scheich dollar is not going to be a pleasant experience because the vast $500 billion trade deficit will result in a 30% devaluation probably every 6 months, maybe every 8 to 10 months. The scrutiny for the foundation of the new dollar is going to be incredible, powerful, and very bothersome to the Washington officials who are going to say things like, trust us, we have the gold. And the world is going to say, we don't trust you, we've been watching you for the last 30 years. The devaluation of the dollar with this new Scheich dollar will result in shortages because some countries, even though there might be a better system for trade payment in the form of a different domestic dollar, might not want to use that dollar. They might say, we don't want your new Scheich dollar because we expect a string of devaluations. And then come the shortages in the U.S. economy, the price increases, not just from the devaluation of the new Scheich dollar, but from shortages from other countries, the exporters to the United States, not wanting to accept the new dollar. So they'll say, we're going to develop our Asian client base, export more to China, export more to Korea, Japan, Indonesia, Malaysia, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and less to the United States, which brings about shortages in the United States.
And to be
so
very
price
blunt,
increases, price inflation, supply shortage, and social disorder, primarily at supermarkets and gas stations. Those 3 are the main symptoms coming up to the United States.
To be very blunt, that's another way of saying people are going to have to do unthinkable things to get what used to be, everyday commodities. When you talk about what would be going on at supermarkets, at gas stations, etc. Something I've been telling people about for quite some time, and with any luck, hopefully, a few more will take it seriously after having heard this.
Yeah, if I could maybe just use 2 words to simplify what the effect of the new Scheist dollar would be on the United States. Third world.
Mm-hmm. Mad Max.
It's to the point where the majority of Americans really don't know what the dollar is. I don't think even my brother does. I'm certain my father doesn't. I challenged my father 2 years ago. I said, Dad, it's sad, but most Americans don't know what money is. And my dad said to me, Jim, what an arrogant thing to say. And I said, Dad, let me just ask you, do you know the difference between legal tender, the dollar, and money? And he said, no. I don't know what you mean. A dollar, money is what I have in my wallet. I said, no, that's legal tender. That's what you can use to buy milk or pay your bills. So the dollar is a denominated coupon of debt backed by the U.S. Treasury bond. So we don't use money as legal tender. We confuse matters.
And the reason people don't know that, therein lies the problem, or one of the many problems, with the U.S. education system, making it a point to see to it that its citizens are not educated about even the simplest of things, the way our government works, the way our civic system works, the way our banking system works. That is all very much by design, by, we'll call them the powers that be. Absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more on that.
And because they don't know, the American public doesn't know what money is, they're going to be hit broadside by this new Scheist dollar. I kind of giggle. Once in a while I'll read an analyst article, and he'll use the term new Scheist dollar when discussing the inevitable end of the current dollar and its structure, when he will introduce the concept of a domestic-only dollar. So it's becoming understood that what replaces the current dollar is going to be a very much risk-filled new currency. And its characteristics are going to be pure third world. We've got to do some things that are extraordinary, and I'm not sure they're possible.
But one thing that is possible is for folks to do what they can of their own accord, not to rely on government to do it for them. Self-sustaining, food preparation, making sure that they've got means to fortify their homes, etc. Because even if you are one of the people that's prepared for the inevitable, then who do you think everybody that hasn't prepared for the inevitable is coming after when it hits? So I think we all have a real you-know-what storm heading our way, and I'm just thankful for guys like you that continue to ring the bell to try to wake up more and more people about the horror show that is eventually going to come to our shores. We keep putting Band-Aids on it, but that sooner or later you're going to have to pay the piper. And again, I can't thank you enough for continuing to just ring that bell for people to hear, because you've got your own way of doing it, one that I certainly responded to several years ago. And more and more people, based on the emails that I get, continue to respond to it, because I keep getting the quote, when is Dr. Willie coming back on? When is Dr. Willie coming back on? So I want to thank you, of course, for coming on. Let everybody know that they can subscribe to your Hat Trick Letter at goldenjackass.com. As I mentioned earlier in the broadcast, there will be a link in the notes section so that you can subscribe to Dr. Willie's Hat Trick Letter. I've been a member now for several years, and I would encourage anybody to sign up for that, because, again, it's He who controls the information controls, ladies and gentlemen, and there is a reason that your government is controlling the information that gets to you, and there's a reason you're not getting the information. It's because you're more easily manipulated when you're less informed. So take advantage of guys like Dr. Willie who are willing to provide you with the information. All you need to do is subscribe to the newsletter. Anything I leave out, Jim?
That about covers it. People need to prepare for a wave of paper asset losses that will result from the introduction of the new currency. The Hattrick letter has been around now for 12 and a half years. No, I'm sorry, 13 years plus, sorry. In April, it was 13 years. There are two monthly reports within the newsletter. One is called the Global Money War Report, and the other is called the Golden Currency Report. I invite people to go to goldenjackass.com website, bounce around, look at the free material. If you're well along studying these concepts, take a look at some of the stuff and sign up for the newsletter. I love telling my two favorite compliments, Mike, and that is, I was a member of your newsletter for a few years, and back in 2013 I quit and I thought I'd look at some others, and now I'm back. I wish I never left. I missed out.
I'm missing a couple of zeros.
The other compliment I get is the last couple of years since I heard your promoted analysis, I've been reading your reading your public articles. I've been listening to your podcasts, and I thought, well, I don't need to sign up because I'm getting it. But a few months ago, I signed up, and I don't know why I didn't 2 years ago. It's just so much more, so much richer than your interviews that scratch the surface. Okay, so people need to prepare. They need to be aware. And what I find encouraging is the very, very low public confidence figures regarding the U.S. government and the news networks. And the news includes finance. So they're not getting proper word on what's going on. And if you're comfortable that your mutual funds and your 401ks are doing well because the stock market is up, you need to take a close look at who the main buyers are. It's the Federal Reserve, it's not investors. So you're getting a pumped up, propped stock market to keep you asleep.
And we all know that they're not above lying to you either. We've seen that over the last couple of months. So the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. When you know that the mainstream media has been, over the top, making up stories for the last 10 months, why anyone would think they'd do anything different for the economy is just slap stupid.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on, Mike.
Thank you for coming on, Jim. It's always a huge pleasure to have you on here. I'm always excited when I get to hear your interviews on anybody else's channel. To be able to get the chance to talk to you myself is always something that I greatly look forward to, as do my listeners. So we look forward to having you back on again soon.
All right, my pleasure. Thank you.
Take care.